Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Art of the Sword Zoom conference. And we're going to be going now with our final presentation of the day. It is called It's Dangerous to Go Alone, Epic Swords in Gaming. I have with me today someone I've known for almost 30 years. We go way back. We used to do stage combat together. We used to do theater together. We used to game together every Sunday night. We would play Dungeons and Dragons with a bunch of friends. So this is Mr. Benjamin Higgins. He is the social media manager and manager of Quarterstaff Games of Burlington, Vermont. And Quarterstaff is sort of a mecca of New England game stores. So basically everybody who's ever been to Vermont has gone to Quarterstaff and has done something there. So Ben, hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on this. As Matt said, I'm Ben Higgins, manager at Quarterstaff Games. I've been with the company for almost 8 years now. Started part-time. Now I'm one of the managers there. It is Vermont's oldest local game store. It's one of the biggest there as well. You mentioned that, I have been trained in some stage combat. We did a lot of acting together early in our lives. We have several fight choreography credits, both of us working on the same projects together in various high school theater productions. So this is great to be able to be back here, reconnect with you after all these years, and hang out. So yeah, I'm excited to talk gaming swords with people.
Yeah,
today.
so we're going to talk about gaming swords. So swords and gaming culture sort of go hand in hand here. It's like Mountain Dew and D&D. You can't have one without the other. So let's what have you got for us today, Ben?
Sure. So I like to over prepare. So I've got a little bit of a slideshow presentation for everyone today. So I'm going to get this up and running for people. So hopefully people can see that now. But yes, so we have It is Dangerous to Go Alone, and this is epic level swords in gaming. So I'm a big fan of defining terms when we talk about things, and especially some of these words I'm going to be throwing out there may not be familiar to those people that are in the historical realm of swords. So let's define what gaming is. So it's by definition, it is the action and practice of playing games. Pretty simple, but it was originally used to discuss gambling, and it was super popularized in the 1800s, and then it really started to fall into decline until about 2000, and that's when video games brought it to its modern usage and really brought it back to the forefront of popular culture. And then for the purpose of this list, gaming we're gonna talk about video games and also tabletop games that you sit around and play face-to-face with people. We're basically capping off with this presentation a 3-day celebration of the sword that Matt has put together. And that's something that doesn't happen to a majority of weapons. And why is that? Well, in my opinion, it's the iconic nature of the sword. Is there any tool of battle that's more iconic? If you show anyone a silhouette or an outline of a blade weapon, they can tell you it's a sword. Every militarized culture around the world had their own version of it, or borrowed or stole it from someone else. It's a symbol of strength, virtue, and even today it continues to impart a sense of awe and myth in our modern society. Usually we only see it now in ceremony and special occasion for the lay person. So what is it? And that's kind of the approach that I went with when making this list of epic level swords that I wanted to talk about today. So I promise this is the only cheesy PowerPoint graphic that I have today. But just what are the swords that evoke the power and passion in gaming? First off, I want to talk about the Vorpal sword. Now this appears, as I'm speaking about it, in the context of Dungeons and Dragons. It's not relegated to any particular style of sword. There are many forms of Vorpal swords that we see throughout many different games. But why, if such a variety of sword exists, where did the term Vorpal come from? And that is actually Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky in 1871. One of the stanzas that mentions the blade is 1, 2, 1, 2, and through. The Vorpal blade went snicker snack, and he left it dead, and with his head he went galumphing back. Now, the term Vorpal doesn't really get defined. It's actually only used twice in the poem, and Lewis Carroll did not give any inclination to what Vorpal actually means. It was one of his nonsense words, which were prevalent throughout the entire poem.
I was going to say, I think there are a lot of words that he just sort of threw in there that he never described what they meant.
Absolutely, and it was really left to us to interpret what that meant. And when the term kind of resurfaced in the 1980s with Gary Gygax and the D&D role-playing system, it really leaned on the impression of that cutting through the head and left it dead. And in D&D terms, that meant that it was on a critical hit, a die 20 roll of, originally it was 18 to 20. You actually had 3 chances to critically hit. That was kind of reduced back to just whatever a critical hit was in later editions. But it would decapitate the target and instantly kill it if it could not survive without a head. And for a lot of the descriptions, it's got a gleaming edge in the image that we have there on the screen. The red indicates, just this sharpness, this otherworldly deadliness that these weapons kind of pervade. It was featured in 7 different adventures across the first few editions of the game, so it was probably the first like iconic magical weapon that Dungeons and Dragons got. It's unfortunately one I've never had the opportunity for a character to wield, and after doing the research for the presentation and everything, I need to fix this. So I'll definitely be looking for groups where I can join, just so I can have a character that can use a Vorpal sword. But yeah, it entered in just a whole era of iconic magical weapons. There's the Sun Sword from the Ravenloft setting, the +5 Holy Avenger, which paladins would take against evil creatures. And yeah, it is kind of interesting just to know how these lines of stats on a sheet of paper gave birth to these weapons of awe and myth that were just almost throwaway lines in a nonsense poem nestled within a greater story. So it's really interesting. This was the one I wanted to kind of lead off with, because it's really probably the first weapon that gaming latched onto and really gave a greater sense of purpose to through its magical properties. Next up, this one brings us a little bit into the future, and in the setting of the world, we're definitely going very much into the future. But this is the Buster Sword. You could easily classify this as a great sword, but as you can see from the image, this blade has more in common with like a steel I-beam than it does with a claymore or a Zweihander. So. This is from the Final Fantasy VII video game. This actually came out in 1997. It's possibly the most recognizable video game blade, and that's mostly due to just the completely unwieldy nature of this weapon. It's this is not a practical weapon in any sense or imagineering of the word. It's wielded by the main protagonist of the video game, which is Cloud Strife, which is shown in the picture there. And the blade could actually be upgraded and improved over the course of the gameplay through a use of materia, which was a mystical resources that could be slotted into those 2 holes at the base of the sword. Or if you look at other source material, that's how he was able to wear it on his back, by hooking it through loops. So whichever the situation needs, as you find with a lot of these mythical swords, these fantastical creations in gaming, they're not necessarily grounded in reality by any sense of imagination.
Although there is somebody who's I think he's actually from Vermont as well, who's been making like life-size replicas of these.
Mm-hmm. If I'm thinking of the same bladesmith, you are. It's he goes by the online handle Michael Cthulhu, I
Yeah.
believe. And yeah, he's created real life versions of this. Canonically, they end up being about 6 feet long. And actually, the first one that I think someone actually created in the real world was in the early 2010s by bladesmiths of the Baltimore Knife and Sword Company for their web series Man at Arms. And being a 6 foot long sword with a width of 12 inches across, theirs clocked in at nearly 80 pounds. So good luck doing any of those lunges or fencing moves that Justin and Brittany talked about in the previous session with this thing. It's absolutely just ridiculous weapon. The blade ended up reappearing in later installments of the series, but it was usually referenced as like the butt of a joke because this is an absurd weapon. And in that absurdity, it's been given permanence in the cultural zeitgeist ever since then. You've got through all the different Final Fantasy games since 7, there's some form of Buster Sword that a character can either wield, or it's referenced. A lot of times it's a fake. Like this, the sword has even achieved mythic status within the world of Final Fantasy. People tend to recreate it for their own use within the franchise. So it's if that doesn't make a sword epic, I'm not sure what will. I want to for our next one, we're gonna pop over and return to the tabletop. You're gonna kind of notice I flop back and forth between tabletop gaming and video games within these. But the next one is another absolutely ridiculous advancement of a blade, because what good is one blade when you can literally have hundreds of them rotating around? This is the chainsword, and this is from Warhammer 40,000. It's another fantastical weapon that has a lot of different classifications. You've seen one-handed versions, two-handed versions within the tabletop miniature game, but it's predominantly depicted as a single-handed sword. And in some of the most early sculpts of these little figures, if you're not familiar with Warhammer 40,000, it's a tabletop miniature game where you have little tiny men and women, and just these warrior depictions with outrageous armor and getup. Yeah, it's ridiculous, the weaponry that gets put out there. They have multiple different swords, but the chainsword is the one that just stands out above all others. And a lot of the earlier ones had a scimitar-like curve. How you get a chainsaw blade to like recurve back in on itself as it's spinning, I don't know. But this is the 41st millennium. No one actually cares. So yeah, this is probably the most unrealistic sword on our list today, because it's not just a hunk of metal. It's got to house its power source, the motor to run the chain blades. It's just a mechanical creation that is seen all the time on these battlefields of the 41st millennium of the Warhammer world. It's used primarily by the Imperium. Other factions have their own versions, but none of them are quite as widely visible as those used by the Imperium of Man. And as I said, they range different versions. The larger two-handed monstrosities that they call the Viscerators, and those are wielded by the superhuman space marines, kind of the angels of death of the setting. Mechanically, these chainswords would provide modifiers to dice rolls, which would allow the characters that wielded them on the table to impact opponents' armor, shredding through them, and really making ideal weapons for cutting through more protected targets of everything. Within the story itself, they have like an extensive upkeep and maintenance needs. Like you basically have to rebuild it after every fight, because teeth will chip off and motors will burn out, and you will probably lose an arm in a fight in the 41st millennium. So good luck wielding this after you've had your hand taken off at the elbow. And more recently, we saw a version of this iconic style weapon, a new spin on the chainsword in the Destiny 2 video game, which is produced by Bungie Studios in the form of a weapon called the Lament. And that was obtainable after a pretty lengthy quest that just really emphasized the brutal nature of what a chainsaw weapon actually would be. And the mechanics in the video game really emphasize the fact that this is a engine that you have to rev, and if you press a few extra buttons in that video game, you get bonus damage as you actually get the chain moving and turn it into an actual cutting mechanism rather than just something which would provide a bunch of little pinpricks if you were to actually swing it at someone without any form of cutting. Yeah, this is probably one of the weapons that I'm most familiar with on this list. I played a lot of Warhammer. I'm a big fan of the Destiny franchise. So seeing this weapon always brings a smile to my face when it appears on a model or in a video game, because it is so ridiculous. I mean, you can't help but smile when you see this monstrosity show up, and you just know something really impressive is going to happen with it. Whether it's an impressive fail or an impressive success, it doesn't really matter. So it's a good one. It's a classic, and it's one that I hope no one actually ever recreates. Although probably a lot of people have tried, because this thing would be beyond dangerous. Let's pop on to our next one, and this is the Sword of Fire and Ice, which is a card from the Magic the Gathering collectible card game. Not to be confused with a Song of Ice and Fire, which I kept moving those things around when writing my script. The prevalence of Game of Thrones has been, I guess, taking over my brain since it wrapped. But this is part of a cycle of 5 different cards, each one exemplifying a sword. That this one in particular carries an infusion of red and blue mana. If you're familiar with the Magic the Gathering game system, basically all of the magic of the world is encompassed in 5 different colors of magic, and each one has different aspects which they draw upon. This one being blue and red relies on thinking and emotion working together, which is why I think it's one of the ones that resonates so well with gamers. Gaming is something deeply emotional, but it also really allows us to tap into our tactical brains and really look at different puzzles and put them together. And this one also just exemplifies the cycle of the sword themed equipment cards from the entire Darksteel set from which they were originally printed. They combined creature buffs as well as 2 powerful effects. One was the protection mechanic, which would basically make your creature immune to the colors that it kind of drew its aspects from, and then had repeatable triggered abilities. Every time it would do damage to a player in the game, you would get a couple of really nice effects. In addition, the semi-permanency of the equipment cards in the game meant that the resources you invested into these cards usually were won back in a lot of value as the games progressed and developed, which just made these cards tournament staples. This one in particular, you could draw additional cards and dealing additional damages, which are both innately tied to progressing your game plan towards winning, and so this one made it firmly to the forefront of the cycle when they were compared against each other. While this particular card is no longer legal in the current meta, the power levels have kept them super popular in a lot more of the tournament formats, such as Modern, and especially Commander, which is a multiplayer way to play Magic and is probably the most popular format of Magic the Gathering. If you're looking to get into Magic, that's actually the one I recommend people take a look at, and you can run with these swords as well. The original cycle of 5 swords, it was more limited in scope, but then they expanded it to a full cycle of 10, so that every color pair within those 5 colors of Magic was now represented. And then Wizards of the Coast, which is the publisher and developer of this game, even made an 11th sword as part of a non-tournament legal parody promo pack, which tied into their other fantasy game, which gave us the Sword of Dungeons and Dragons. So that sword in itself would make dungeons and make dragons in the game. And if you're asking how to make dungeons in a game of Magic, now you know why it was a non-tournament legal parody version. So yeah, I've got a few things that I want to just kind of talk about in terms of honorable mentions, because there's so many different swords out there.
Before you get into honorable mentions, Ben, somebody actually brought up the Baltimore Knife and Sword has a series. They put it on YouTube called Man at Arms.
Mhm.
They actually made a functioning chainsaw sword.
Oh my gosh, they did. Of course they did. Because why would we want safety in anything that we do? That's yeah, I mean, with any of these swords, I'm sure you could find someone that has tried to recreate them. It's the pervasiveness of these different blades and just how they interact with our imaginations and our desire to have a relationship with these swords means that, yeah, people are gonna make them. They're going to set aside being told they can't have something, and they're gonna figure out a way to make it work, which is really really cool to see that creativity. So before we get to the one that I'm going to talk a little bit more at length about, I did want to bring out these honorable mentions. These are swords that may have a place in your heart. They're from other circles of nerd culture. In some talks, they may be considered epic, but for now, I'm going to leave you mostly to explore kind of their stories on your own. And the first one is the Keyblade from the Kingdom Hearts franchise. Now, this was originally envisioned to be a chainsaw-like weapon, like the chainsword, but it kind of got its non-threatening key shape as the Disney franchise was attached to that project during its initial development. So it's now we kind of look at it and we wonder how this actually cuts. Looks like it's more of a mace or a bludgeoning implement at this point, but they do call it a blade, so we'll keep it in there. Next, we have the dagger from Clue. This not technically a sword, I know, but it's quite possibly the first bladed weapon that many of us ever found in our games. The game of Clue dates back to 1949 in North America, 1948 as Cluedo in our European markets. And yeah, I mean, this blade itself has probably killed more mansion owners than any other blade in the world. So whether it was done in the library or the conservatory, this blade is deadly, and you should be on the lookout for this one. Back to video game territory, we have the energy sword from the Halo series. This weapon was not part of your normal arsenal in the game. You had to take it off your fallen enemies and then wield it against them. It required getting very up close and personal in what is a immersive first-person shooter, where you would maybe not want to close the ranks to some of these enemies. But such is the allure of a bladed weapon that many of us threw caution to the wind while playing this and said, we don't need that sniper rifle where we can complete this mission from 300 meters. We want to see our enemies go down in front of us. And I mean, that speaks to the draw of the sword as a trope and as an item, probably deeper than anything I could actually talk about in that regard. I did think about putting the Star Wars lightsaber in this slot, but that's so tied to the movies and to franchises. It's not necessarily a gaming piece. So the energy sword of Halo is kind of its surrogate. within this list. Next, we have the Celestial Swords. These are from the Legend of the Five Rings collectible card game. It also is a very robust role-playing game system as well. These were gifted to the great clans of Rokugan by the gods themselves of that world, and they were passed down to whomever led the clan, but were very rarely seen in battle. These really exemplify the reverence that a lot of the Japanese sword art has for the blade and its place within the samurai and the Japanese culture, which the Legend of the Five Rings game systems really treated fairly respectfully. You can never get anything right when you're dealing with gaming, unfortunately. But I think they did a good job and really respected a lot of the inspiration when they put these out there. So props to Alderac Entertainment Group for handling that as well as they did. Next, we have Frostmourne. This is from the World of Warcraft RPG. This was actually appeared in game files for the popular MMO, but was never made available for players to obtain. It was that carrot that drove people to dive deeper and explore farther in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. But alas, it was never made available to those characters. Later on, certain classes of characters, the Death Knight specifically, were able to forge new weapon from broken shards of this blade. So they eventually threw their player base a little bit of a bone. But the story of Frostmourne is actually a pretty epic one, and I would encourage people to check it out, even if you just read through a wiki and give it a go. It's tied to a lot of lore within the world and some pretty cool story in behind there. And then probably one that no one would have ever thought would ever be described as epic. We have Boffers for live action role playing. I mean, whatever foam wrap PVC pipe or molded latex blade, boffer weapons, they've been the safe way to beat up on your real life geek friends while enjoying some light role play on a summer's day. And many gamers, if they haven't embraced live action role playing wholly, they've at least attempted it. And there's just something super empowering as a gamer to be in your head as a character and hold a sword that you can actually swing at people safely and do so. So these are definitely worthy of some epic tales, but not today. So, and then next, we kind of come to what many would consider the most iconic sword that gaming has ever produced. It was actually the inspiration for the title of this presentation, and that is the Master Sword from The Legend of Zelda. So this is a hand-and-a-half sword that was almost always wielded one-handed by the character Link in tandem with a stout shield of varying different various shields, and it actually got a companion shield at one point. When the very first NES game, The Legend of Zelda, hit the console in 1987, players were just dropped into this super large fantasy world that they had no weapon, they had no defense, they had a character who could walk around. And then first thing they would do would be normally to check out this cave that appeared at the top of the first map they were in, and they were handed a sword, and that sword was frail, it was made of wood, it provided a little bit of measure of protection and attack, but as the character of Link cleared the dungeons and recovered different pieces of the mystical Triforce, their abilities grew, the character grew, and they were able to upgrade their weapon to its true potential. The sword itself was not actually given the name Master Sword until A Link to the Past, which was the third entry in the franchise. But the visual aspects of the sword have been in the game ever since the beginning in all their glorious 8-bit beauty. It's really, if it wasn't for the chainsword being something that I absolutely just geek out over all the time, the Master Sword is the one I have the most experience with. I've been a Legend of Zelda fan for years. I would rent the NES game every weekend, trying to beat it. Hopefully no one overwriting my save file, because I didn't actually own the game. But it always drew me back in, and going through all the different iterations of the sword and everything and how it came about. They're kind of like, there's three pillars to my geekdom. There's Star Wars, there's fantasy roleplay D&D, and then there's The Legend of Zelda. And this sword has been a staple of my epic geekiness for, since the beginning, since I was old enough to hold a NES controller and play this game. And it's really cool to see where they've gone in the increasing this game. It always is a sword that starts out weak and gets better as you, as the character, get better and your skills increase. And that has made its way known through different mechanics, whether you've had to increase your life meter or master different techniques with it by hitting different buttons in different orders, or even in a game that just got an HD remaster announced a few days ago, the Skyward Sword, which actually has motion controls. So you're swinging your controller around, pretending that this little tiny piece of plastic in your hand is this epic sword. This one has probably had more iterations and more attention brought to it than any other sword in the history of gaming. There's very little else, I think, that could hold the top tier of an epic level sword here. As I mentioned, in every game it's appeared in, the power of the sword can never be fully harnessed until you've upgraded and enhanced your own abilities, your own skills, which really seems to indicate that the power is not from the sword itself, but actually from the wielder, and is merely kind of channeled into the blade.
See, folks, there's a moral.
Yeah, definitely a moral in there as well. The view that the blade is only as good as the blacksmith that forged it, and the warrior that wielded it, is one we've probably you've taken away from other presentations as we've gone through the actual historical look of the sword and the art behind it. And definitely the Master Sword really is no exception. And unlocking the weapon in the game, we do not master the sword until we master ourselves. Is definitely something to take away, I think, from this entire weekend. Excuse me. I definitely talked a little faster than I intended. Hopefully people caught everything. It's been a while since I've been hanging out with everyone, but if you have questions or comments, I'd like to know kind of what gaming sword did I miss. Let me know.
So talk about the Master Sword again for a second here. I remember when Twilight Princess came out for the Wii. That was the first Zelda game for the Wii, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess, they actually had a dual release. There was a GameCube version, and then there was also a Wii version that came out as well.
But for the Wii version, didn't they make or at least didn't the cottage industry of gaming things make a like small Master Sword replica that you could actually put the Wii controller up into?
Yeah. I remember that. There were various ways to just indulge that fantasy, even more than just holding your controller in your hand, to actually give yourself a sense of agency and urging with that as well. So yeah, it's a pretty crazy bit. So
you skipped over lightsabers because you said it was too intertwined with the movie, right? We do have to give at least an honorable mention, because the movies themselves have spawned all sorts of games. I mean, there's been video games, there's a role-playing game, there's I think there's a card game, isn't there? A tabletop card game.
Oh yeah. So the Star Wars franchise is it's bigger than anything we've probably talked about here today. It's
lightsabers a whole other session in itself.
And when you start really diving into the lightsaber, that's actually I don't think I'm qualified to give a talk about it, but there are entire schools of lightsaber training that fans have made, where you can learn the different techniques and styles that are depicted in the movies and in the books and in the games that they've kind of taken and flushed out and made actual sword techniques and styles with a lightsaber. So it's definitely something I'm not 100% up on. I've always kind of engaged through with lightsabers as a viewer rather than a participant. But for anyone interested in looking into that, there are numerous resources online. I believe one of the biggest one is called Saber Academy, and they deal with not only light contact lightsaber battles, but the whole kata and reverence of the blade and the styles itself as well. So,
And I think it also plays into how gaming in of itself isn't sort of a standalone thing. I mean, it's connected to this greater culture that draws upon movies and literature and fantasy. I mean, while yes, itself there is that gamer culture of still even more in video games, but it's expanded even more. So I mean, almost any sword from quote unquote nerddom or fandom could be talked about in a gaming setting.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's I mean, as we've kind of touched upon here and there throughout everything, there's just the mysticism that today's modern culture has lended to these different weapons. On the card there, like we've got, I actually have an image of a diamond sword from the Minecraft video game, which these are blocky sprites, which still depict these gorgeous weapons of war and tools of battle from years and years ago that pervade even a game about digging into the ground to get stone and then building things with it. That game has a sword in it. Like it's everywhere.
Well, does anybody have any questions for Ben about anything that we talked about or anything really?
Yeah, let me know. Like I'm happy to talk swords, happy to talk games. I know it was kind of a quick overview on everything. And there, I'm sure I missed your favorite sword, and I would love to know what it is, because when we talk about gaming is such a personal thing for people. What resonates with you and what you find fun and engaging is something that Matt may find completely different, or that I find completely different. And that's one of the really cool things about gaming. I'm fortunate enough that when people kind of ask me, like, what does my job entail working at Game Store? Well, I get to sell fun. And what does that mean? It can mean anything to people. And the fact that swords are fun is really cool. I'm a big fan of that. So.
Well, then let's ask you your question. What is, I know you sort of talked about your favorite sword in gaming with that chainsword, but the big question of what is your favorite sword?
My favorite sword. Overall, I think my favorite real life sword, because I'm going to give two answers here. I'm going to give my favorite sword in gaming, which I've already talked about a little bit. But my sword that I enjoy more, and I've got so many fond memories, it was actually the sword that I procured. It was a swept hilt rapier for when we did Romeo and Juliet together. That sword unfortunately met an untimely end at another performance later on. It broke in too many places for me to repair. And I'm always on the hunt to try to find it again, but I think that particular model has been discontinued.
That was the black hilted one, wasn't it? The all black.
It was like a bronze hilt.
Yeah.
My least favorite sword is probably the one that you stabbed me with, but that's another. That's a whole nother.
Yes, folks. So Ben and I, not to brag about each other, but we got pretty good at the routines that we did. We got good enough that we could start doing that on a moment's notice, basically, and just go into the routine because we practiced a lot and we trusted each other. I'm sure I diminished some of that trust when I put a rapier blade through his elbow, basically.
It was good. It was good.
Yeah. He was fine though. It was a clean stab.
Very clean wound. Yeah.
Missed
yeah.
all the bone. They just went home, put a band-aid on it. He was fine. He was fine.
It was good. It was fine. Yeah. But yeah, if you as a viewer have never felt steel rub up against a bone, it's a very interesting experience. I don't recommend you try it.
Don't fight in the dark. You don't fight in the dark either.
Don't fight in the dark. No, well lit areas, and don't try to improvise.
Yeah.
Which I think was my fault. I went for a move that you were not prepared for, and I got in trouble for it, which is good. So,
Alexander Hoffman does note that video games have recently tried to represent HEMA combat more faithfully, like Nordhau or Hellish Quartet. But have any tabletop RPGs tried to emulate any realistic fencing or HEMA more accurately that you know of?
So it's really difficult in the tabletop world to represent this, because either we're looking at static objects like miniatures or cards that are trying to represent this, or we're looking at board game mechanics, which are usually distilled down to flipping cards or playing cards in certain orders or categories, or dice rolls. It's as David says, it takes an hour to complete a 30-second fight. Within the tabletop role-playing world, a round of combat, which can take 10-15 minutes to go through everyone involved in the skirmish, is supposed to represent 6 seconds. So it's very hard to realistically depict these as in tabletop gaming, just because of the time constraints that actual physical combat is so fast and requires so much skill that distilling that down to a couple of game mechanics or dice rolls doesn't do it justice. So I think probably that a game that tried to do it the best, and I don't really know if I can say it was successful or not, was the late 1990s, the Highlander collectible card game, which, if you're familiar with the Highlander franchise, is all about epic swords and fighting to the death. And every card they had would have a block or a parry or a thrust kind of mechanic. And it was all about kind of bluffing with your opponent what cards you might play and hoping you had the reaction to defeat whatever they threw at you, and that they would not have the thing to get your damage through on them. And that might be the closest. And that's 20 more than 20 years ago now at this point. So the technology of equating an actual HEMA level style of combat to a game table has really not improved on much. Definitely video games are the realm where they can push that a little further and keep it a little more true to form.
Well, Ben Higgins, Quarterstaff Games, thank you so much for doing this for me. It's been a lot of fun talking with you. Follow Ben. He is a recent Twitch streamer. What's your Twitch handle?
I'm gonna share my screen up there on the panel again. If you want to continue the adventure with me, you can follow me on Twitter. It's Higgins802, or Instagram Higgins.802. Twitch is also Higgins802 on Twitch.tv as well. Stream a lot of gameplay. We talk about different games, and it's we're all about spreading fun. And I'm glad we were kind of could wrap up your conference here with a little bit of a fun palate cleanser to bring everyone back to earth even in a fantastical way.
So thanks a lot, Ben.
Absolutely, thank you so much.
So that concludes our last panel. If people just want to stay on for a second, I'm just going to do a brief sort of